Welcome back to the Spiritual Misfits podcast. I am so excited that today Caro and I get to hang out with Father Joash P. Thomas. Welcome, Father Joash, to Spiritual Misfits.
It's so great to be here. And thanks for being up at 8 a.m. your time to have this conversation.
Look, as far as navigating time zone differences, 8 a.m. is very respectable. I'm very happy with this. Definitely have done some earlier mornings. Um, Father Joash, you are someone I've followed online for a while and have really appreciated your voice, your perspectives, your work. Um, in your Instagram bio, it says priest to the misfits. So you are literally like you are a match made in heaven for this podcast. Um, I'd love to hear some of your backstory, and in particular, if you could share a little bit about maybe the flavor of spirituality or Christianity that you grew up with. And then along the way, did the phrase spiritual misfit, does that ever feel like a term that might have resonated with moments in the journey for you?
Such a good question. I think I come from a long line of misfits in the church and the history of the global church. So I'm a St. Thomas Indian Christian. My family's been Christian 2,000 years, thanks to the Apostle Thomas. Um, but we were non-white Christians in the Eastern Church who had very ancient, indigenous, although creedal ways of knowing God and neighbor. And when colonial missionaries showed up 1,500 years after we'd been creedal Christians already, um, they essentially told us we were heretics, right? So more than misfits, we were labeled heretics and dominated, brought under subjugation of first the Portuguese Catholic Empire, then the British Empire tried to do that as well. Um, so I feel like it kind of runs in the DNA for me to
Mm,
be a fellow misfit. Um, but yeah, I was born and raised in um, the global South evangelical tradition, and the Pentecostal tradition more specifically. Um, my dad is a fourth generation Pentecostal. Before that, we're St. Thomas, both my parents' side. My mom grew up Anglican Orthodox. Um, they got married, and then essentially, moved around a lot in my childhood, and then moved to the States when I was 18, and then moved to Canada about 10 years later. So I'm a two-time immigrant, which also makes me feel like more of a misfit, being an
mm,
immigrant and having those experiences. But yeah, I very much feel like a priest of the misfits now because, um, so much of my ministry is around unpacking um, justice, the way of Jesus. My book
mm,
is called The Justice of Jesus, and it's just it's inviting the church to see justice as central to the task of the church, as central to the mission of the church, the gospel, the good news of Jesus. And so much of this history has been lost in the Christian tradition because of empire and the way empire colonized and co-opted the church. Um, I'm inviting the church to retrieve that. But I think I mentioned this in my Substack recently too. My Substack's called Masala Chai Theology, and something that has happened for me writing this book is I get invited now into a lot of practitioner spaces, church leaders, missions leaders, even all over the world, who want to wrestle with what does decolonization in our missional context look like. Um, but the fascinating thing that I've also noticed is that people asking these questions, or even people doing the work of justice, who follow Jesus, often feel like misfits in the church, because this is not the dominant position of um, certainly the evangelical church that many of us come from. So yeah, so I feel like I feel privileged to be a missional priest now, which basically means I'm a priest without a parish, which frees me up to travel, teach, bring the sacraments with me, and just be a priest on the margins of the church,
Mm,
because that's where Jesus is. Jesus is in every place on earth that's considered a margin to empire.
mm. Oh, that's really cool, and glad that you're bringing some of that traveling priest love and ministry into this space. Um, I was reading a bit about sort of some of the things that you've been through in terms of your work life, your vocation, and you had a really interesting journey to the priesthood, from what I can tell, Father Joash. You worked in political consulting and lobbying. You then spent a decade with International Justice Mission, or IJM, people might know of. You've got degrees in politics, Christian leadership, and systematic theology, which I think is a pretty rare combo. Um, how have these different paths converged to form who you are? And do you see them as, kind of being brought together, those different threads in your current work?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one thing I've learned, um, being an itinerant minister for over a decade and a newly ordained priest as of a few months ago, 6 months ago. One thing I've learned doing this work is nothing ever goes to waste in God's economy. Um, Transferable skills are a real thing. And so for me, I've definitely seen that. I think when I moved to the US, I wanted to be American so bad. I wanted to assimilate and fit in so bad that I dropped my accent in the first 6 months. So I've been stuck with this weird Midwestern American accent ever since. That's worked well in Canada. But one of the other things I did was I started working in Georgia Republican politics. Because that was the party in power, and I cared about justice even back then, but I had different ideas of going about it. I thought, if I join the majority, the people in power, maybe I can reform from within. And then all those illusions fell flat in 2016 when the party showed its true colors, and reform voices within the party were pushed more and more to the margins. I was one of three never Trump Georgia Republican political consultants. So glad that's a line I could never bring myself to cross. Um, but yeah, then in 2017, I share the story in my book, um, The Justice of Jesus. So I ultimately, was asked to ghostwrite an opinion article on immigration, but more specifically opposing legal immigration, and even more specifically the type of legal immigration pathway my family came to the U.S. through. I did that, sold my soul to empire, and then woke up the next morning, uh, realizing the gravity of what I'd done and how it betrayed my own humanity. Um,
Mm,
and
wow.
Jesus ultimately comes to show us how to be human, how to tap into the light of God that is already within us from the moment of our creation, not from the moment we first pray the sinner's prayer, but from the moment of our creation. Um, and and so I could feel that disconnect, and that's what led me to go into international human rights. Um, so worked with IJM all over the world, three different countries, supporting teams all over the world for over a decade. And I think it was doing the work of justice on the margins, in a very imperfect institution run by Christians, just like all Christian institutions ultimately. But being a part of the good still taking place. It was quite formative for me to work ecumenically, to work with um, as an evangelical back then, to work with Catholics, people who I was told were not real Christians or were not devout Christians, right? And that those perceptions blew wide open. Meeting with the Catholic Bishops' Conference in places like the Philippines was quite formative for me. Meeting survivors of trafficking who taught me more about Jesus um, than even without saying the name Jesus, they taught me more about Jesus than some of the best pastors and theologians I got to study under, right? I mean, just having experiences like that with Jesus in the margins uh, transformed me, really. And that was my formation into the priesthood. Um, Ultimately, wrestling with questions of theology, especially when you have evangelical pastors asking the team that I led regularly, hey, what's the point of rescuing these kids from trafficking if their souls go to hell? Aren't they dead in the water anyway, right? So just coming across
Jeez.
colonial theological frameworks like that push me to decolonize, push me to confront this thing called colonialism and how it shapes the church and the world today. And the book was born out of that. My ordination was born out of that. So yeah, it's been a unique, fascinating journey. I could have never authored a script like this. A lot of plot twists for sure, but I'm really grateful for experiencing what it's like to be a misfit so that I can now be, a priest to the misfits.
That's so good, Father Joash. Yeah. Amazing journey when you think about all the places you've been and even the worldviews and perspectives that you've journeyed through, like living them from the inside, not just sort of seeing them and then being able to emerge with the most authentic version of faith that comes up from your historic roots. You call yourself a masala chai theologian. Talk to us about that. And for our Aussie listeners, I'm imagining that when we talk about chai, because here in Australia, if you go to a cafe and you order chai, if you want the real genuine spices, tea, you have to ask for a specific type of chai. Otherwise, you'll just get syrup or powder. I don't know if it's the same in Canada. And also, I don't know if like getting a dirty chai is a Canadian thing. Do you know, have you
It
with the
is.
coffee in it?
Yes, I've come
So
across that.
yeah, if you have your ultimate chai recipe also, you could drop it in here. But yeah, what is when you talk about being a masala chai theologian, what does that mean?
Yeah, yeah. So there's fascinating history. Um, I often get accused by, Indian uncles and aunties in the church of never praising the virtues of colonialism, right? So I'm like, sure, I'll give you two, cricket and masala chai. Uh, I'm a massive cricket fan, by the way.
Yeah.
Yeah, we although I did joke with one of my British friends this week, who's a fellow cricket fan. I said, I feel like in cricket, Australia is like the Argentina of the cricket world.
Yes.
Everyone hates them because they're so good. Uh, so, you
Although
know,
we just lost to Bangladesh. We just lost a test match to so I'm just like, I mean, all power to Bangladesh, really like impressive. And it's, but anyway.
yeah, yeah. I mean, it is fascinating that Bangladesh did what India couldn't do in our last visit there, right? And
Yeah.
so anyway, I could talk about cricket all day. I probably lost half the audience here with my spicy cricket takes, but masala chai theology. Um, so it really comes from the history of masala chai, which is, the British forced chai upon us. They forced tea upon us from China, forced us to cultivate my ancestors to cultivate tea plantations um, at the cost of feeding our families, right? And so many of our ancestors were starved because of this colonial way of rearranging the agrarian society and the economy. And so what ended up happening was we would then produce all this chai, this tea that got exported to England. Um, but out of and I say this facetiously, out of the kindness of the colonial hearts, they would let us have the really crappy parts of the tea plant, and the best parts of it would get exported over. So what we did was we took those crappy parts of the tea plant and we started throwing in our own spices, our own masala blends, and this is why masala is so neat because there are a million different definitions of masala all across India. Masala is whatever you want it to be. And everyone, just like curry, everyone makes masala their own way, their own unique ways. Um, we started spiking the chai in ways that upset, the palates, the taste palates of our colonial masters. We made it a thing. It's a whole industry today where anywhere you go in India on the roadside, there'll be someone selling chai. You walk into someone's home, the first thing you get offered is a chai or a masala chai, and it has spices, but it's also deeply invitational. We through relationship, we unpack heavy things. We talk about heavy stuff. We laugh. We have a good time. It's very hospitable. And so that very much is the tone of the theological work that I want to be doing, that I'm doing. Theology that's hospitable, invitational, but also theology that upsets the empire-shaped palates uh, a little bit, for us, for the liberation of all of creation, ultimately. Yeah.
So good. You've talked a little bit about your book, The Justice of Jesus, but give us the elevator pitch for that book, and what it's all about. So those who are listening today and might be thinking, "Hey, I want to pick this up," will just know what they're going to get in their hands if they
Yeah.
buy it.
Yeah, yeah. So book's been out 11 months now, and just to keep it interesting for my ADHD brain, I have to find new ways to keep talking about it, right? So I'm going to use the language I used speaking with 5,000 teenagers in the UK last week, um, where I used gamer speak, and I said, I really only have time for one game on the Xbox these days, cricket. But to, to put it in gamer speak, um, the justice of Jesus is not a side quest for the church. It's the main mission of the church. And so many times um, we've been distracted by the trappings of empire throughout church history to think that it's something we do for extra credit on the side, something that's optional. Um, and I'm a professor at St. Stephen's University with Bradley Jerzak and other friends of your community. So I also use professor lingo here. But the justice of Jesus is really, it's not an extra credit assignment for the church. Um, it's the main mission of the church. And so many of us who know this still tend to put justice in a bucket at times. So we outsource justice. We say we care about justice, but we outsource the work of justice. Even in progressive spaces, folks outsource the work of justice to organizations like IJM, or to a committee on the church, and it's their job to do the justice stuff, and we pay them the money to do that, right? But the justice of Jesus is costly. It's expensive. It'll cost us something. In fact, it may even cost us everything, like we see with the Old Testament prophets and Jesus and the early church. Um, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Martin Luther King Jr., Desmond Tutu, Rosa Parks, folks all throughout church history. The justice of Jesus has a cost to it, um, and it's important for us to wrap our heads around it, to reckon with the cost of taking up our cross and following Jesus um, on behalf of our marginalized neighbors. And this book essentially invites us to do that, but it also invites us to examine why many of us have been raised in the church to think that the justice of Jesus is a side mission, as a side quest. And that's because of this thing called colonialism that I get into in the book, which isn't a political buzzword to people from the global South or to Indigenous peoples in Australia and Canada and
Mm.
the U.S. Right? It's a real thing. It's our lived experience. We were under the boot of oppressive empires that did all kinds of colonial extraction of wealth and resources, including settler colonialism that we see. But but the argument I make throughout the book is that colonization wasn't just bad for the global South; it was also bad for the West and the Western Church because it shaped us to resist justice movements for all our
Mm.
marginalized neighbors in our context. So queer folks and the church being excluded, I see that as a result of colonialism. Women being marginalized from leadership spaces in the church, I see that as a result of colonialism. And as our mutual friend in Australia, Jared McKenna, often says, um, fascism is basically when colonial empires, take what they've been doing overseas and then start doing it in their own communities. That's how we get fascism.
Mm. Really important work, and definitely a book that will pop the link in the show notes, and hopefully a lot of people listening will go and check that out. One part of justice is obviously the work of peacemaking. And, the idea of the peacemakers, blessed are the peacemakers, like, number one phrase on the tongue of Jesus. And yet it does also feel like maybe a bit of a side quest for folks. And I think the thing about peacemaking, I think it's hard to disagree with the beauty of the sentiment, but I think a lot of people feel like perhaps if they're not an activist or if they're not an influencer or if they're not in some significant leadership position, like what does it look like for an ordinary person who is potentially struggling under the systems that we live within to actually step into peacemaking? And I'd love to hear some of your thoughts, Father Joash, your encouragement and invitation to kind of ordinary, everyday people who might feel like I don't have that activistic sort of, um, platform. How do I become a peacemaker where I am?
Yeah, so good. And that's such a good question to be wrestling with. I mean, I would say to folks, if you're even asking the question, um, God's smiling on that. And even if you're not, God is still smiling on us because we're beloved children to God. Um, but this is exactly why I wrote the final section to my book, which is how your local church or how you can prioritize the justice of Jesus. And I have 3 chapters in there: prayer, advocacy, and partnership. Um, and and these are 3 things that I think all of us can do individually and collectively, and we're called to do them both on our own and then also with community. I start with prayer because I feel like we have lost. I feel like we've watered down the role of prayer in the church. We've reduced prayer in the church to an individualistic, capitalistic pursuit of accumulation. Um, and there's a place for intercessory prayer that you see in Scripture, but it's not lost on me that when Jesus' disciples ask him, how should we pray? Jesus says to them, pray then in this way, and he leads them in the Lord's Prayer, which is profoundly a prayer about justice and peacemaking, right? Even praying, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven, is an empire resisting prayer. You're praying for another kingdom to come and
Mm,
peacefully, non-violently invade the empires that have dominion in our spaces that cause people to suffer. Um, you know, uh, even the sentence, forgive those who sin against us, as we forgive. Yeah, forgive us as we forgive those who sin against us. Even that part is a prayer for peace and making peace, right? And ultimately, prayer, the way Jesus taught us to pray, should shape us to pursue justice, to be Jesus in the world today, and and that's the purpose of prayer. Formation. Um, More than passing on of information to God, and formation for the sake of transformation, for the sake of renewal and justice and peace in all of creation. And so prayer is something that we can all do. But what if we saw the purpose of prayer? What if we reframe the purpose of prayer from being an individualistic pursuit to a pursuit for the flourishing of all of creation, in alignment with what we see Jesus define the gospel as in Luke 4:18, good news for the poor, the oppressed, those who have been made poor and oppressed by empire. And so I would say prayer is always a good place to start if you're unsure of what that next step looks like. It's been so fascinating ever since writing the book. Um, I get invited sometimes into spaces where people are like, here's my context. What do I do? You're the expert. You tell me, right? And I'm like, no, no, no. I am not the expert just because I published a book on justice, right? Um, I'm a theologian, so I'm offering theological frameworks to help widen our imaginations. But I want to give you the tools for you to sit with the Holy Spirit and for you to discern
Mm.
because I am convinced that the Holy Spirit, the same Spirit that breathes life into creation, the same Spirit that anoints Jesus to preach good news to the poor, um, the same Spirit that falls upon the church even today, that Spirit wants us to seek Creator God in understanding how we can participate in this work of justice and renewal. And um, yeah, and I think it's important for us to wrestle with the Spirit in our own context to figure out what that next step looks like. And I think it starts with a posture of prayer. Um,
Mm.
there's also obviously other things like advocacy and partnerships, generosity, but even reframing all of that from, how do I outsource the work of justice in my life to how do I actually be the justice of Jesus? How do I embody the justice of Jesus wherever I am? And the last thing I'll say is something I say throughout the book is God doesn't call us to success. We're called to faithfulness. And so what does that look like in the pursuit of justice? Um, what does it look like for us to just be faithful and to be just be content with faithfulness instead of um, idolizing success, even in the pursuit of justice?
Mm. Feels like we have this hangover from those kind of empire flavored Christianities. If we're not changing the world somehow as an individual, then then there's no point. Which even just interrogating that idea, like why is it that I have been led to feel like my life must do something so grand, and that it isn't godly and beautiful and just and good to live a small, ordinary life well and faithfully. Even that very idea that we feel that pressure is probably something worth sitting with and examining.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
I think, Father Joash, that many of our listeners and myself included, like grew up with a huge emphasis on, the Great Commission as the main quest of the Christian. Um, but you're bringing this idea that justice is what Christ calls us to. I wonder if you could just speak into that, speak into like your understanding of the Great Commission and how it may have become a tool of empire, and perhaps what its origins mean, or how we understand that in light of the importance of justice.
Yeah, such a good question. It's a question I've been wrestling with and unpacking on Masala Chai Theology, my Substack. I've been doing this series called Decolonizing the Great Commission, with I think 5 parts to it so far, or maybe 4. Um, but yeah, I think the Great Commission is absolutely something that needs to be examined, that needs to be decolonized. Um, and I say that for a couple of reasons. So, first off, like just from a textual standpoint of scripture, um, the words Great Commission were never in the Bible until the colonial era. And even then, it was added as a subtitle in the English translations that were being published in colonial empires, so the word Jesus never uses the word Great Commission. Jesus invites his people to go and be witnesses. We see that in Acts 1:8. But the thing that Jesus talks about more is this thing called the Great Commandment, the greatest commandment, which is actually something that Jesus directly says. The greatest commandment is uh, to love God and to love neighbor as oneself, right? And to hold those two together. Um, but I feel like what's happened is empire has caused us to get distracted from the great commandment that Jesus actually gave us verbally, and invent this thing called the Great Commission, which very much comes from colonial theological framework. So, another source on this, you don't have to just take my word for it. One of my PhD supervisors, along with Bradley Jerzak, is going to be this incredible Malawi origin scholar named Dr. Harvey Kuyani, who is in the UK training Church of England missionaries on decolonial missiology. He's written this book called Decolonizing Mission. And in it, he takes the term mission, the term mission was essentially co-opted from the military world. Um, we used to not use the word mission and the terminology of the church before the Jesuits really came about. They were the first ones, and Ignatius of Loyola was a former soldier, and so he kind of took that word mission and brought that into the church, and very much came about the time of colonialism and the papal bull for the doctrine of discovery, where the Pope explicitly gives empires the permission to go convert Christians in quote unquote heathen lands, and to even enslave them if needed. This is official Vatican Church history right here, right? And so, and it's shaped the policies of settler colonial empires like the U.S. and Canada, even today, and even Australia. Um, and so again, it's important for us to take our understanding of that text and decolonize it from the influences of empire. Because when we do that, because Jesus does invite us to go and be witnesses, right? And so what do we do with that? Well, I think the way the early church and the early Eastern church practiced that is profoundly different from the way the Western church sees mission today. So I'm not saying that there isn't a place for Christian mission. I'm saying we need to decolonize it of its colonial influences that are all about dominating and subjugating and convincing someone else about the inferiority of their logical ideas, and using force, you know, um, or forceful rhetoric like apologetics, um, to defend the Christian faith without a posture of love, and gentleness, and so I think Christian mission should profoundly be hospitable. It should be invitational. Um, it shouldn't seek to dominate. Shouldn't seek to subjugate. Um, it should be. It should look like Jesus. It should look like 1 Corinthians 13. Love bears all things, keeps no record of wrongs. Right? Like Christian mission is love. It's proclaiming the love of God by being the love of God. Um, I'll say this as well. I had a Christian teenager ask me, as I was speaking at this Christian youth festival in the UK, I had a Christian teenager ask me, I love Jesus, but I am in a school context where kids I go to school with um, are very opposed to Jesus, very opposed to anything that's Christian, and I get it. But how do I be Jesus to them? Do I just be the justice of Jesus to them, or do I um, try to convince them with my words, right? And my response, and it just kind of came to me in the moment. I never actually wrestled with it before. I was like, um, the image I'm getting is that of Jesus on the cross, and the Roman centurion who walks up to Jesus on the cross, right? The centurion who put Jesus there. And what does he say? And the teenager is like, yeah, he says, surely this is the Son of God, right? And I'm like, yeah, and what did Jesus say to that person? Did Jesus convince that person with his words? No, Jesus lays his life down and and lives in a very anti-empire way, in a very nonviolent, peaceful way, resists empire. And that is what convinces, this Roman centurion that surely this is the Son of God, right? And so I think that's what Christian mission should look like. It should look like taking up our
Mm.
crosses, dying to ourselves, our preferences, um, and acknowledging that Christ has, as Scripture teaches us, again, Christ has already been present everywhere. So again, this might sound like a controversial statement to many of us in our empire-shaped imaginations, but there are no unreached people groups to the love of God. Um, an unreached people groups, that categorization is a colonial categorization. It's a colonial era
Mm.
myth, just like the Great Commission is.
Mm. That's great, Father Joash. Um, the centurion story I've been fascinated with before because he
Yeah.
makes that statement before the resurrection. And to go back to what we were saying before, it's almost like he sees something in Jesus' posture, Jesus' sacrificial love, the way that Jesus suffers that actually doesn't need the vindication of he came back to life again, or he did a miracle, or he was successful. It's actually in the moment of total failure that he is recognized as the Son of God, which I think is another profound thing to think of when we feel like we're in the failure part, where we haven't seen whatever we perceive as success. That our posture in those moments is can speak so loudly. Um, you've spoken about the danger of separating deconstruction and decolonization. You know that actually to do deconstruction without decolonizing is kind of pointless, which I think is a challenge for folks that might see themselves as progressive or open minded or whatever, but maybe find that is the next step that gets neglected or and you've used terms in this conversation like our empire shaped imagination, or these phrases that we only hear one way because we've always heard about unreached people groups, or we've heard about mission, or we've heard about the Great Commission. Would love for you to talk about the importance of not just deconstructing faith, but decolonizing. And I suppose a sub question here is I feel like people can have the sense that if I just do those sort of negative sounding things, what will I be left with? And I'd love for you to speak about when we actually do those things, what does it create in terms of generative soil for something that might fill if we tear apart everything that we've been given? That's a scary thing. So how would you kind of encourage that work, but also lead us into a generative and expansive
That's
imagination?
beautiful. That's beautiful. Let me tackle the second question first, since that's fresh in my mind. And do remind me of my first one if I lose track of it. My ADHD meds are starting to wear off this time of day here in Canada. But um, you know, yeah, I think it's so important for us to uh, yeah, well, I mean, one, have a posture of continuing to decolonize. So never thinking that we've arrived, or pat ourselves in the back, because to do that is to underestimate how pervasive empire really is. Empire is pervasive. It's the air we breathe, it's the water we swim in. It's shaped everything in our world, to the point where I've seen empire show up in progressive Christian spaces. I've been around the block enough to have seen that. I've seen empire show up in Christian justice organizations, right? And it's because our imaginations are so narrow. We haven't decolonized them. We think that we have all these assumptions. We think that the world should be this way, a certain way, right? And so um, I'll go here, I guess. One of the things that I've been unpacking more and more in my Substack recently is this connection between capitalism and colonialism. And I don't think we can have an honest conversation about decolonizing without also having an honest conversation about the vehicle of colonization, the economic vehicle of it, which was capitalism. Um, Capitalism in many ways was invented to serve the colonial empires of their day. Um, the first public shareholder company um, in the history of capitalism was the Dutch East Indies Company. The second most prominent, I guess, company with public shareholders was the British East India Company, right? Modern banking, like bank transfers, were invented because of British soldiers in India who were looting wealth from Bengal and wanted to send it back to England through Delhi or something like that. And so that's how the banking industry was invented, with bank transfers and things like that, right? And so much of and we bring these systems and structures into um, deconstructing spaces without reckoning with the capitalism that still corrupts us. Seeing
Mhm.
people as economic units of production instead as beloved children of God's who don't have to produce to be worthy of love. That's a decolonial idea, but it's also a deeply anti-capitalistic idea. And I think a lot of us, for example, are okay with, you know, starting to do the work of decolonizing, but we get really uncomfortable when we hear critiques of capitalism, because our imagination has been shaped to think um, that there's no alternative to that. You know, our imagination has been shaped to think that that's yes, it's the less of two evils, but it's, you know, what are you going to do, kind of a thing, and which is ultimately a narrow imagination for the church. Um, you know, we need to be out there inventing new systems um, of of doing economics, and I think this ties to your second question, Will. Um, you know, but the thing is, unless we uproot what empire has planted, unless we weed that out, we will never have the imagination to know what to plant. You know, in Jeremiah 1, um, Scripture teaches us about, you know, there's a time to uproot, a time to weed out, and a time to plant, right? And so many of us have been shaped by empire to rush to fixing problems, and, you know, let's just go plant something. But, you know, I've been learning as a fairly new gardener. Um, I'm marrying someone next month who's a pro gardener, and she's taught me. She's also an Ignatian spiritual director. It's a deadly combination right there. But
Awesome.
she's taught me um, that, yeah, weeds pop up, and you know, unless you deal with it and weed it out completely, you can't really plant anything that's good. And I think that's what the work of decolonizing ultimately is. I think deconstruction, using gardening metaphor, is to prune, but some stuff, you know, you can't really just get away by just pruning a weed, right? Like, I mean, you can
Mm,
do it, but it's going to pop back up and choke life around it. So some stuff needs to be uprooted at its core, and I think that's the work of decolonization. It's courageous work because we may not have the imagination for what goes in there yet, but I think we should trust ourselves, and I think we should trust the Spirit of God at work within us to give us the imagination once we uproot that. And it's scary, but Jesus is there when we
mm,
do it.
beautiful.
Yeah, that's so good, Father Joash. I think this idea of imagination is so important because I think I do think it's hard for many of us who have just been steeped in colonialism, been steeped in empire, to actually even have a perspective of what our faith may look like if it's pruned from these things, if empire's kind of weeded out of our lives. But I do think there are examples in Christian history of places where the gospel has taken root outside of empire. And I think we see that, like you talk a lot about Celtic Christianity as an example of where faith took root in the soil, separate to empire. And probably also, you know, with Thomas believers in India, we see a similar thing. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about both of those pictures of Christianity and what they might do to help spark our imagination for what faith can look like without empire.
That's so good. Thank you for asking that, Caro. Um, you're so right. You know, there have been these alternative imaginations to Christianity that haven't been the dominant ones, but they've been there on the margins of Western empires and Eastern empires because, you know, I mean, so many of these Christianities didn't have access to political power. They never sought it. They saw it for what it was, um, and suffered for it. So, you know, in the West, you've got ancient Celtic Christians in the tradition of Saint John, the one who, you know, laid his head on the chest of Jesus during the Last Supper and heard the heartbeat of God. And so it's a very mystical tradition, has a very different way of seeing God than Saint Peter and Saint Peter's tradition, right? Which is more dogmatic, legalistic. I'm going to chop your ear off if you mess around with me, kind of a, you know. And then you've got the tradition of Saint Thomas, the one who doubted and is shamed in so much of the Western Church for having doubted, but also the one who courageously worked through his doubt, who walked closer to Jesus to examine for himself, to work through his doubt, and was so convinced of what he saw that he came all the way to India and died there, never went back home. So and my family wouldn't be Christian today if it weren't for the legacy and influence that he had in southern India. So our tradition was very much a tradition that made room for doubt and for different ways of knowing, um, and different ways of being at peace with our neighbors of other faiths. Um, so we lived at peace with our Hindu, Muslim, Buddhist, Sikh neighbors. Um, uh, yeah, more so Hindu, Muslim, Buddhist, for 1,500 years before the colonial powers showed up and brought with them Christian supremacist ideas of, this is the only way of knowing God, and everyone else are heathens that need to be brought under the sword or convinced out of their ancient ways of knowing. My ancestors didn't feel that pressure. We didn't feel the need to convert our non-Christian neighbors. We felt the need to learn from them and to see Christ in their spiritualities, and expand our imagination. So again, these are different ways of knowing that have historically been suppressed by colonial empires. And so what I'm trying to do through so much of my work in Substack, but also this next book I'm working on, proposal should be going out soon, is just this idea of retrieving these ancient ways of knowing, to heal the church and the world today, to expand our imaginations. Because again, these were creedal Christians. They held to the creed, so you couldn't accuse them of being heretics. They just had different ways of knowing on secondary matters, and that's what's happening in the church so much today. Like people are being shamed for being queer inclusive by being told you can't be a Christian and blank. But that's a very cult-like position, historically speaking, because historically it's the creeds that have united the church, and whatever issues we may have with them, it's fair to critique it. Yeah, it's important to recognize that there were creedal Christians in the Celtic and Indian traditions who were shamed for being heretics, because they disagreed on other matters, much like today.
Mm. Wow. Father Joash, it is towards the end of the day for you, and we've made you do a lot of work articulating big ideas, and it's been a feast, I have to say, or it's been like that masala chai hospitality. This conversation, full of rich and beautiful flavor and provocation, and welcome and invitation. So I want to thank you very much for what you've offered us, as well as allowing you to go and do whatever you do in the winding down into the evening part of your day. Also, I mean, I love that you're getting married to a gardener slash Ignatian spiritual director, and the two of you sound like you will be just an incredible force for good and beauty,
Thank
in the
you.
world. So congratulations on that
Mm,
too.
so good.
Appreciate
Um,
it. Yeah.
Want to give you the last word,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
is always the way. What would be, for people that have made it through this conversation with us, who may feel like misfits, who are, maybe craving a new imagination or the gifts of the ancient church, but interpreted in a way that makes sense, facing the challenges of 2026. What would be the final word or phrase or encouragement that you would want to leave people with who've been with us in this conversation?
Yeah. I mean, I would say, if I can provoke a little further, I would say don't settle for vanilla. So many of us have only been exposed to one flavor of Christianity, um, a Western empire-shaped colonial framework of knowing Jesus. But there are so many other flavors out there. There's chocolate, there's strawberry, there's butter pecan. There's, I don't know, like what's a unique Australian flavor?
Vegemite.
Vegemite. That's amazing. Is that a thing? Is that an ice cream flavor?
It's not ice cream. No. If you ever
Probably
saw
somewhere there.
Vegemite ice cream, it is a spread that you have on toast,
Yes.
and it tastes like a bit like salty dirt.
That's right. I have
Glorious
tasted
salty
it.
dirt.
Yeah. Oh, that's incredible. Let's go with Tim Tams, right? Like I love Tim
Yeah,
Tams.
yeah.
That's my guilty dessert of choice. There's Tim Tam flavor out there, right? Like, I mean, yeah, there's so many different flavors of Christianity, some of which have been lost. And some of us are doing the work to retrieve. But yeah, if I would say, if you feel marginalized for your love for Jesus and justice, and if you feel like, people are calling you heretics for loving your neighbor a little too much, you're in good company with Jesus and the saints, because the heretics of empire are the beloved of God.
Thank you so much, Father Joash.
So good.